And welcome back to the second hour of the Velocity of Now. The second hour tonight will get a bit dark, but you know me, I think I always tell you this stuff's important to know. I want to talk about one particular subject that's important right now, and I want to profile a very bizarre crime that took place in the 1920s in Chicago. But firstly, those of you who been paying attention to the alternative media recently have, I'm not going to mention any names, have become aware that a certain individual in the movement has developed a psychosis thinking they are the prophet Elijah. Now, this is not unusual by any means within the so-called truth movement. There's one individual here in Ireland who's a host of a little-known radio station program on Wednesday nights who believes he is a god who gave birth to a planet and was sectioned by his own wife and kids, his own wife, in a maximum security psychiatric hospital in order to protect the kids from him. Now, this guy is on every Wednesday night on his radio show screaming his delusional psychosis, and everything that comes out of his mouth is an aspect of his mental illness. And yet he is the flagship host for this radio station. We have another one, like I said, who's declared himself Elijah. We have a history of people claiming they're the son of the Godhead. And it's always gone on. We have David Wilcock, who I will name, saying that he was the reincarnation of Edgar Cayce. This will always be a problem in any kind of area where you have a notion of danger and salvation. Like we have in 2012, I was attacked by a completely theocratic psychotic who worships his mother-in-law as a god living on another planet in the future. And they run a quote-unquote alternative and unbiased news site when basically it's all based on channeled alien material. And this guy is so completely off the wall that he actually sees his own mother-in-law as a god. And that's how insane it's always been. So this latest thing on religious psychosis or theocratic psychosis or psychotic theology is nothing new, and it's to be expected, and it will always happen. It will never not happen, as long as these are people who have a powerful messianic psychosis and feel the need that they have the ability to save the world or save the cult that's surrounding them. And they will attract like-minded psychotics. Now, although it may seem very, very comical and almost, absurd, and in some ways it absolutely is, but there's always a danger that this can spill over into something very, very dangerous, especially when drugs and notions of messianic salvation are involved in terms of people's finances. This is an interesting one. You never hear about this, but a lot of the reason people get involved in cults or join the cult compound is because they failed economically in the outside world. And the guy that I'm talking about who attacked me in 2009 through this ridiculous website that claims to be a news site, he is a complete failure of a man in every way. Both the roof over his head, the job, and his wife have all been supplied to him by the cult leader, his mother-in-law, who he worships as a god. It's because in the real world he failed. And you'll see this over and over again. In the real world, they fail. So they enter into the cult compound as a kind of a last chance saloon. Their lives have fallen apart, and there's nothing else for them in the real world. Now, when you put someone in that position, you've basically created a rat backed into a corner, and it will kill. It will think nothing of killing in order to maintain it, because there's nothing else for them in this life other than their theocratic psychosis that they have that put them in that place. There are certain hotspots around the world that seem to attract cults. A lot of this has to do that the intelligence services are involved in them. The south of France is one place. Switzerland is another, very big in flying saucer, alien contactee kind of cults. And the Mexican-US border, particularly on the border with the USA, but also down through the sort of northern half of Mexico, There's always been an issue with these kind of Aztec revivalist cults. Lots of them are drug gangs. Lots of them operate within the kind of drug world element. But what distinguishes these from many other cults like this is the viciousness of the crimes and the depravity of the killings, as well as the absolute intensity of the psychosis. Now, there's one case and one individual I want to talk about from the early 1960s called Magdalena Solis. Now, Magdalena Solis was known as the High Priestess of Blood. She was a serial killer and a member of a cult in Mexico that was responsible for orchestrating several murders and participating in drinking the blood of the victims. She was convicted of only 2 of these murders, but she still got 50 years in prison. She's one of the few documented cases of a female serial killer that clearly had sexual motivation, and she was a sex offender. She was an organized murderess, psychopathic visionary, and a sexual predator who killed in groups. Now, Magdalena Solis was responsible for at least 8 murders that we know of. According to some sources, the actual number maybe close to 15. And they were all committed in the small community of Yerba Buena, near the city of Monterrey in the Mexican state of Nuevo León. Magdalena represented herself as a goddess. She believed she was a goddess. You see, this is one of the things that bothers me about all these New Age women who call themselves goddesses. Could you imagine? It leads to delusional psychosis that they can judge and evaluate anyone who, according to she must be obeyed. So could you imagine a man going around calling himself, I'm a god. But yeah, a lot of these New Age women have no problem calling themselves goddesses. That's something very interesting to think about further. But Magdalena Solis represented herself as a goddess and ordered numerous sacrifices for blood rituals. She came from a poor family and was deeply dysfunctional. Apparently she began to practice the profession of prostitution at a young age. And she worked in that until her marriage, along with her brother Eleazar, who was actually her pimp, and in tandem with this guy called Santos and the Cretano Hernandez cult in 1963. Both her and her brother joined the sect, and Magdalena Solis developed what they call theological psychosis. She was an extreme religious fanatic and suffered from religious delusions and the usual delusions of grandeur. And her marked sexual perversion that was expressed in the consumption of blood, vampirism, or whatever you call it, of her victims, and intense sadism in which she committed her crimes, and was also a practice of incest, fetishism, and pedophilia. Now, one of the things they said about her was she had incredible strength while she was in these states. And you often find this, that whether it's a kind of possession or it's an arrival of the repressed autonomous complex, these types generally have incredible physical strength. They say the mad have, the insane have the strength of 10 men. But there's a fine line there between where does that strength come from? Is there something else inside them? So anyway, she joined the Hernandez brothers sect in around late 1962 and early 1963. There was 2 brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, a pair of small-time criminals, and they had a scam which they thought was brilliant and would solve all their Monday problems. They reached a small town of Yerba Buena, which is a tiny community in northern Mexico with a population of only 50, and all in extreme poverty and mostly illiterate. And the 2 brothers proclaimed themselves prophets and high priests of the powerful and exiled Inca gods, which is a bit weird because the Incas didn't actually exist in Mexico. They were in Peru. So anyway, they were told that the Inca gods, in return for worship and tribute, would give them treasures hidden in the caves of the mountains surrounding the village. You see, again, people on their last leg drawn into cults. We saw that at Jonestown with the people, the African Americans, the poor inner city African Americans, duped by Jim Jones. And also, cults are very heavily involved in Native American reservations in the U.S. This is why you have the growth of all these Native Americans who are obsessed with aliens and things like star nations and stuff like that. This is all CIA and other cults in the reservations trying to take advantage of these people's poverty. So anyway, the two brothers claimed that the treasure was hidden in the caves of the mountains surrounding the village, where they also performed the rituals, and it would soon come to claim authority over their former kingdom and punish the unbelievers. So this is the marginalization. That we'll kill the unbelievers, and we will be the leader. And we're the true prophets. Now, as I said, they were completely bizarre because Inca gods belonged to the mythology of pre-Hispanic Peru, and it would have been more logical and correct for them to say they were Aztec gods. But the inhabitants of the village of Yeba Breno were also ignorant and downtrodden and believed this nonsense. And if they believed this nonsense, thus the Hernandez founded a relatively prosperous sects, and the group members demanded the economic and sexual taxes, both women and men. The two brothers went from being simple thieves and cheats to sexual slaveholders, organizing big-time orgies in which they used narcotics. So they may have invoked some real demonic archetypes doing this. They continued running like this for years, for months actually, on which day believers began to grow impatient and not seeing the usual thing, there's no gold, came about. So then the brothers, like typical cult leaders, when the comet clusters don't show up, they devised another plan. They went to Monterey in search of prostitutes who wanted to be part of the farce and made contact with this Magdalena Solis and her brother, who agreed. During the sort of like initiation ritual using a smokescreen magic trick, Magdalena Solis, as the reincarnation of a goddess, they presented her as a goddess. What no one counted was that she would actually believe the lie. This is incredible. Now, people say she would believe the lie that she was a goddess, but there's also another way of looking at it. Maybe this ritual, even though it was a cheap ritual involving smoke and chanting and drumming, maybe it did actually bring in an entity into her. So right after she was joined the sect as the new goddess, she took it over. By then, two of her followers, who were tired of the sexual abuse, wanted to leave the sect. The other believers, who were prisoners of fear, were charged before the high priests, and they were condemned. The condemnation was clear: the death penalty. The two unfortunates were lynched right in front of the group by the others. This is a classic cult thing again. So after the first two murders, which is typical of serial killers, their crimes evolved. You see, I was talking about Savile there in the first hour of the show. It doesn't end at just having sex with dead bodies. It evolves and escalates. And in this case, with the serial killer, it becomes more violent. Bored with simple orgies, Magdalena Solis began to demand human sacrifices. She devised a blood ritual. The sacrificed, which was always a dissenting member, so anyone who was a non-believer, was brutally beaten, burned, cut, and maimed by all of the members of the cult. Thereafter, she practiced bloodletting. The victim was made to bleed to death. The blood was deposited in a cup mixed with chicken blood, and the ritual also included animal sacrifice and the use of narcotics such as marijuana and peyote. Oh, marijuana it does no harm. It's a shamanic medicine. Yeah, right. So Solis drank from the chalice and then gave the drink to the priest. The Hernandez brothers and Eleazar Solis, her brother, and finally gave it to the other members. So it was like a transubstantiation kind of thing. This is probably what Catholicism came from, some kind of Mithratic blood drinking rite. Presumably this gave them extra natural powers, and in her case it absolutely did. Now they were moving into, at this point, they kind of had realized the error of their ways by going on about the Incas, and they've moved on to they now were proclaiming themselves part of the Aztecs. And using their own Aztec mythology, the blood was the only decent food for the gods. See, they were gods now. And she believed, as the other two, that it preserved their immortality. The goddess needed to drink blood to stay young forever. We've seen this all through history. Countess Bathenroy in Hungary, who drank and bathed in the blood of hundreds, maybe thousands of virgins captured from around Central Europe. Magdalena was supposedly the reincarnation of the Aztec goddess Coatlicue. The butchering went on for 6 continuous weeks in 1963, a period in which 4 people died in a terrible way In the last sacrifice, they reached a point of dissecting the heart of the victims alive. The final victims happened in the night of May 1963 when a 14-year-old local resident, Sebastian Guerrero, wandered near the caves where the Solis sects was performing their rites. Attracted by the lights and noises coming from one of the caves, he came sniffing around and met a terrible sight, and silently watching the terrible slaughter of a poor and unknown victim as they suffered. Sebastian was so terrified that he ran for over 25 kilometers to Yerba Buena, to the town of from Yerba Buena to the town of Villagrán, to the nearest police station. Exhausted and still in shock, he failed to give any other description of the group of murderers who prey on ecstasy and who had gluttonously drinking human blood like vampires. Now, the cops at the police station initially laughed at the statements of the kid Sebastian Guerrero, thinking of the ravings of a disturbed or drugged young boy. The next morning, an officer, investigator Luis Martinez, escorted him home, and in the process was able to show him where he had seen the vampires. That was the last day that both Sebastian Guerrero and Luis Martinez were seen alive. So this is like, although it's a horrible thing that happened to them, this is usually the mistake that the cults make. They pick on someone who can take him down. In this case, killing a police officer. So the police, being shocked by the disappearance of Guerrero and Martinez, took the case seriously at last, and they started talking about this satanic cult, or calling it a satanic cult. And on May 31st, 1963, the police, in conjunction with the army, deployed an operation. This was seriously, they took it, they had the army involved, deployed an operation in Yerba Buena. Eleazar and Magdalena Solis were arrested on a farm in the town in possession of a considerable amount of marijuana. Oh, but it's shamanic medicine. Santos Hernandez was shot by police bullets while resisting arrest, and Cayetano Hernandez was the victim of his own lies. He was assassinated by one of the crazy members of the sect called Jesus Rubino, who before the crisis wanted to be part of the body of wanted to be a part of the body of high priest for his own protection. In subsequent investigations, they found first the carved up bodies of Sebastian Guerrero, the young boy, and the copper Luis Martinez near a farm where the Solis siblings were arrested. They had removed the heart of the latter in the style of an Aztec sacrifice. They then found the bodies also dismembered with 6 other persons in the vicinity of the caves. Magdalena and Eleazar Solis were sentenced to 50 years in prison for only 2 homicides, those of Guerrero and Martinez. They were not able to confirm their participation in the other 6 murders because all the cult members attested refused to testify. The usual story. This is why cults often get away. Their former members, even when they're safe, there's this whole mystical god thing is the same. You know, they still live in fear. Many of the members of the sect were shot in the shootout when the police, because they were armed and they barricaded themselves inside the caves. Those who were arrested were sentenced to 30 years in prison for 6 murders in the form of a group or gang murder or lynching. The illiterate and poverty-stricken conditions served as mitigating factors. It was not until years later that some cult members actually spoke of the horrors. See, this is why it's very hard to get any testimony, because the ones who just leave the cults are often terrified. Terrified. In fact, some of the work I've done on cults, I've met people who are 20 years out of a cult, are living on the other side of the world in Australia, and the cult was in Ireland, and they were still living in terror, even though there's nothing that could happen to them. And this is the effects of religious psychosis. This is why it's so dangerous. This is why when you start talking and calling for blood, you run. You absolutely run. Now, one of the things that you'll often hear in these kinds of like religious sacrifices, or well, not religious, but cult sacrifices, is extreme strength. Whatever happens to these people, whatever entities they bring into them, they become extremely charged. And you don't even have to be in a cult to be in a member. You can be in a heightened state of revenge, like a passion crime, or you could be just having a psychotic obsession with another person. and the entity enters you. Anyone who's ever had a stalker will be amazed how all the energy and effort these people put into obsessing over you. They give up on their own family members. They don't have a care for anything. They're obsessed with you. And this is because they've actually, especially if it's been heavy use of marijuana, they've actually been infected. Now, I want an amazing story here that I've never heard about until very recently, and it happened in 1921, and it was this bizarre double murder and a bizarre fate of this guy called Harvey Church. Now, this is an article written by a guy called Edwin Baird. In the autumn of 1921, the second of two mutilated corpses of a Packard car salesman had been found in Chicago. Prime suspect was a puny, pint-sized Harvey Church, their salesman's last customer. One body had been found in the river, and the story continues, the second corpse had just been discovered buried in the garage at Church's home, where the basement is splattered with the blood. Both victims were towering, hefty, muscular men, so how could the frail suspect have handcuffed, bound, and slaughtered them? Meanwhile, Church and his mother had left Chicago in their new Packard car, bound for his hometown of Adams, Wisconsin. When arrested in that town, Church claimed that he knew nothing of the events of his home over the past few days. However, he was brought to Chicago to face an interrogation, and this is a really strange story. The dead man's hands were tied behind his back with rope, which was also around his legs and ankles, binding them securely together. The body was quickly identified as that of the missing Packard salesman Carl Jung. Like his colleague Bernard Doherty, he had been beaten with inhuman brutality. His neck had been broken, his skull fractured, and his face battered until it was almost unrecognizable. But he had suffered an even more horrible death. This was determined by physicians when they made the post-mortem examination. Asmus, though beaten ferociously with his hands tied behind him, was still alive when the murderer had flung his face down in a shallow grave and covered his body with cinders. The killer had then jumped on his head of the prostrated victim, so the physicians believed, and ground his heels into the back of his neck, breaking it, which is very difficult to do unless you have phenomenal strength. And as in the case of Doherty, the motive for the murder had apparently not been robbery. $40 was found in a wallet in his dead man's hip pocket. His other pockets contained some silver and gold pencils, and he wore an army wristwatch which had stopped at 6:48. More discoveries were made when the body was taken to an undertaker's and the clothes were removed. The victim had been tortured in a manner too shocking for the details to be presented to the public, but one fact was mentioned. Coroner Peter Hoffman, standing beside the body, noticed a thread protruding from the swollen lips. He took the thread in his fingers and pulled on it. The thread snapped. He forced the lips apart, and he saw a cloth wadded inside the dead man's mouth. He tried to pull it out, but couldn't. Doctors had to make an incision into the cloth before it could be extracted. When they finally got it out, they stood in disbelief. It was a woman's brassiere. It had been thrust far down the windpipe with gorilla-like strength. Back at the criminal courts building, in the office of the state attorney Robert E. Crowe, investigators were still sweating young Harvey Church and were still getting the same answer to all their questions. I didn't do it. His thin body crumpled in the chair, his eyes darted wildly at the questioners. Try as they did, using every device known to the police for squeezing confessions from defined prisoners, the interrogators could get nothing more than that. The word came out the discovery of Osmond's body, and the questioning ended. The interrogators went into a huddle and agreed on a new strategy. Saying nothing to the prisoner about the discovery of the second body, they turned him over to Lieutenant John Norton. Come along, Church, Norton said. We're going for a walk. The frail young man got out of the chair, watching the detective warily. He was led from room to room, believing the sergeant had placed him in a squad car. Norton drove him first to the Lake Street Bridge near Maywood. They got out at the spot where 10-year-old Eddie Baker had seen the body of Doherty floating in the river. Church was led to the rail, and Lieutenant Norton directed his attention to the muddy water below. A pale grey mist hovered over the surface. "That's where they found his body, Church," Lieutenant Norton said grimly. "It was tied and handcuffed, just as you slid it into the river." Church averted his eyes. His face was pale and drawn in the morning light. "I didn't do it," he whispered. "Come on," said Norton, and led the way back to the car. He drove next to the mortuary where the body of Doherty had been taken, and in the early hours the place was closed, but Norton unlocked the door and led the prisoner to the rear room where Doherty's corpse lay on a slab. Holding Church by the wrist, Norton jerked the sheet from the mutilated body. "There he is, Church. There's the man you killed. Look at him. He can't hurt you now. He's dead. Confess that you killed him." Church staggered back and tried to cover his face, but he didn't confess. "Come on," said Norton, and led him back to the car. Their next stop was a young man's home. The detectives led him through the rooms in the lower flat and down to the basement steps. Norton pointed to the bloodstains on the basement walls. "Here's where you killed him, Church. You handcuffed his hands behind his back and you crushed his skull with a baseball bat. You hammered his face and cut his throat. Then you threw his body into the river. Confess!" Church flung one hand across his eyes and shook his head from side to side. "I didn't do it," he gasped. Norton had saved his trump card. "Come on," he said. "I've something else to show you." He dragged the suspect from the basement across a small backyard into the garage. He pointed at the freshly dug earth and cinders, at the spot where police had disinterred the body of Asmus. "Look, Church, look at the grave. That's where you buried Carl Asmus. He was still alive when you buried him. You threw him face down and you stamped on his neck. You wanted to make sure he'd die. Confess!" "I tell you I didn't do it." Church's voice was now scarcely more than a croak. "Get down there," said Lieutenant Norton, "and show me how you buried him. He's dead now. He can't hurt you." Church knelt down in the shallow grave. His eyes darted frantically. He licked his dry lips. Then he pinched forward at his face and lay still, and then he fainted. The sergeant picked him up and carried him out to the squad car. Norton drove him back to the criminal courts building. He was taken again to the state's attorney office. The questioning was resumed, where it had been broken off, but it showed no promise of getting anywhere. Church still protested that he knew nothing about the two killings. The police and the coroner's office were still divided on their theories. The police believed Church had killed the two men, his motive being to get possession of the car without paying for it. But Coroner Hoffman was convinced that more than one man was involved in the double murder, and there was logic to bear him out. Assuming that Church had murdered the men from the car, would he have driven away in it without making any effort to cover his tracks? Would he have given him the correct name and address to the Packard Company? Would he have awakened his neighbour, Miss Marguerite Gardner, on the morning he drove with his mother to Adams, Wisconsin? And if the motive for the murder was robbery, why hadn't he taken the victim's money and other valuables? On top of all this, could any man of his frail condition overpower two giants such as Asmus and Doherty, handcuff and tie them, and then brutally batter them to death? Some of the detectives were inclined to agree with Coroner Hoffman. They hadn't discarded the theory that the first murder, if not the second, had been committed by an estranged husband or a jealous rival in some affair. Another notion was that the two Packard salesmen had been killed by a gang of car thieves who had planted the evidence at Church's house in order to implicate him and throw the police off the scent. Working on this angle, squads of detectives rounded up a number of suspects and brought them in for questioning. Meanwhile, the interrogation at Church's continued. "Has somebody made you a fall guy, Harvey?" asked Hoffman. Church, near collapsed, answered hoarsely, "Yes. The thing is a frame-up. There are certain men who hate me. They frame me for those murders and they want me to take the rap. They hate me because I scabbed on the Switchman strike. They'll do anything to get me, even murder." "Who are these men?" the coroner asked. Church hesitated. Finally he said, "One of them is Leon Parks. He works in Gus Beriano's garage on 2815 West Lake Street." Who are the others? There's only one other. His name is Wilder, Clarence Wilder, but everybody calls him Bud. I am not sure where he lives, but he works in a shoe factory. Detectives found Parks without difficulty and brought him to the state attorney's office while another squad was looking for Wilder. Parks was a lean, hollow-cheeked young man, about Church's age. When he was brought into the room where Church was held, he seemed nervous and fearful of meeting Church's eyes. Church, on the other hand, underwent a surprising change for the moment Parks entered the room. He rose buoyantly from his chair as if a great load had been lifted from his shoulders. His eyes glittering, he looked at Parks and said sternly, "Look at me, Leon." Leon lifted his gaze to meet Church's accusing eyes. "Yet Harvey," he said meekly. "Yes, Harvey," he said meekly. Church stepped nearer and looked Parks in the eye with a peculiar intensity. "You killed those two men, didn't you, Leon?" "What two men, Harvey?" "You know the two men, the two Packard salesmen, Asmus and Doherty. You and Bud Wilder killed them. You killed them in my basement. You thought you could pin the crime on me, isn't that right?" But Harvey, don't deny it, Harvey. Trust his face into an inch of Parks, and don't try to avoid my eye. Look me squarely in the eye and tell me the truth. Didn't you and Wilder kill those men?" Parks tried to shift his gaze, but when he was impaled by Church's glittering eyes, you see, this is almost like a transformation of personality, as if another entity then entered Church. You understand what I mean? The same entity. Like Church went from being a meek man, until he had found two people he could pin the murder on, and then he transformed into almost like this hard-nosed individual, full of life and vigor, almost as if another entity or personality had entered him. He licked his lips dry and said in a wavering voice, "Yes, Harvey, we killed them." Church looked around at the astonished officers. "Well, what did I tell you?" he said, scarcely able to believe what they had heard. They called in a stenographer. Under a hail of questions from Church and the officers, Parks described in detail how he and Clarence Wilder had murdered the Packard salesman and disposed of their bodies. "We lured them into the basement," he said in response to a question from Church. "We got Doherty first. We handcuffed his hands behind his back and killed him with a baseball bat. Then we got the other fellow and killed him the same way. We dumped one of his bodies in the river and buried the other in Harvey's garage." Chief Inspector Ben Newmark said, "But why did you want to kill them?" Parks hesitated and looked at Church. Church looked sternly in his eye and said, "You killed them for the Liberty bonds you knew I had given them. Isn't that right?" Yes, that's right, Harvey," Parks answered. Most of them, to the questions asked by Church, detail how the crime was committed. Typewritten copies of his confession were given to him for his signature. He had scarcely signed them before the door opened and the detective came in with Clarence Bud Wilder, verbally protesting against his arrest. "Is this the man who helped you with the murder?" Colonel Hoffman asked. Parks looked at the angry Wilder and said, "Yes, that's the man." Wilder exploded. "You liar," he shouted. "Look at my face. You never saw me before, and you know it." Inspector Newmark ended the ruckus by taking Wilder to another room and questioned him privately. "You mean to tell me you didn't even know the fellow was in there?" "I never saw him in my life before," said Wilder. "How about the other fellow, Church?" "I know him," said Wilder, "but this is not the first time I've seen him in weeks. This is the first time I've seen him in weeks. I first met him during the switchman strike a few months ago. We roomed together for a while. What can you tell me about those killings?" "Only what I read in the newspapers. That's all I know about them." "What were you doing on Thursday, the day those men were killed?" "On Thursday," said Wilder, "I was working all day at my job in the factory." Newmark sent two detectives to the shoe factory where Wilder was employed, and orders to interview the foreman and other employees and check the time clock for Thursday. Then, leaving Wilder in the custody of the two detectives, he went back to the room where his brother officers were puzzling over Parks' confession. He stood inside the doorway and looked at Parks and Church. There was something peculiar in the attitude of these two young men, and something still more peculiar in the confession that Parks had signed. He whispered to the detective to get Church quietly out of the room. Then he walked over and sat down beside Parks. "Look here, Parks," he said. "You said you and Wilder killed those men, and that you could rob them. Is that so? How does it happen? You didn't take their money and watches. Park's eyes roamed the room as if seeking help. Inspector Newmark watched him closely. Church isn't here to prompt you now. You were on your own. Speak up. Why did you and Wilder do it? Parks began to whimper. We didn't do it. What? I mean, I don't know why we did. You'll have to ask Harvey. Leon, excuse me. Leon, look, Leon, you needn't be afraid of Harvey now. You tell us the truth. Did you and Wilder kill those two men? Parks, verging on tears, vigorously shook his head. No, he said, we didn't. I didn't know them who killed those men. Then why did you say you had them killed? You killed them. I don't know why I told you that, unless it was because Harvey wanted me to. My God, exploded Newmark. Do you mean to tell us that you confessed to a murder you never committed merely because somebody wanted you to? I was in a dream. I was there. I could see us getting them in the basement. Dougherty first. I knew it was a dream, but it wouldn't stop. We handcuffed him and we whacked him with a... Turn the page here. With a baseball bat, but somehow I wasn't doing it. Only it was a nightmare. Parks was now too confused to speak any more. He could only nod his head in agreement. Newmark jumped up from his chair and strode across the adjoining room where Church was sitting calmly in the chair, guarded by two detectives. What's the meaning of this? He thundered. What is the idea of that guy in there telling us that crazy crap story about dreaming he did those two murders? He had nothing to do with those two murders, and you know it. Church started to rise. Did he tell you that? Just let me at him. The inspector shoved him back in the chair. Not much, I won't. I'm going to keep you right here till I get the truth out of you. First, I want to know what made that fellow Parks confess to a crime he never committed. But he did do it, Church cries. He signed a confession. Let me talk to him again. Sit down, Newmark snapped. Parks is innocent. We know that now. How did you make him confess? You know he's innocent? Church queried. Well, then I might as well tell you I simply hypnotized him. You what? You don't believe me? Bring Parks in here and I'll prove it to you again. Parks was stood in. Church squarely in the front of him and commanded, look into my eyes, Leon. That's right. Now then, smile. Parks, who had been almost crying a minute before, began to smile. Now, Leon, speak the truth. You had nothing to do with those murders. No, Harvey. What were you doing on the Thursday? I was working in Gus Barano's garage. You feeling happy now, are you, Leon? Yes, Harvey. Parks was smiling and his eyes were shining. Laugh, Leon. Parks laughed gaily. Church looked at the officers with a satisfied smile. You see, that's how I'm done it. I simply hypnotized him, and he says nothing I tell him to say. But the officers were in no mood to admire his display of hypnotic powers. Exasperated, they sent Parks from the room and started afresh on Church. This is more like fascination than hypnotism. Fascination is a magical ability to control a person's thoughts through eye contact. What the belief in fascination magic is that the blood vessels in the eyes go directly to the heart. It's the only part of the body where the blood is near the surface and accessible without actually cutting somebody. This is more like fascination. Church is calling it hypnotism, but it's more like fascination because he didn't induce the hypnotic state. You see that when you say, when I do this, you'll fall into a sleep. None of this happened. This was fascination. This wasn't hypnosis. Come clean now, they ordered him. Quit stalling. Who helped you kill these men? I guess Wilder must have killed them, said Church. Wilder and some other guy. But Wilder had an ironclad alibi. The foreman at the shoe factory and a dozen other employees told the detective that Wilder had put in a full day Thursday at the job, and his time clock stub proved that he had. When Inspector Newmark gave this information to Church, the suspect laughed and said, it must have been the other two other fellows. Anyway, that seemed to let Wilder out. Yes, it let Wilder out, and it lets you in. We know that you killed those men. Confess. But Church wasn't ready to admit anything. They had a pound. They had to pound at him for hours before he finally broke. At last he asked in a hoarse whisper, "Can you see my mother?" "Can I see my mother?" "You can see your mother," Newmark told him, "after you've confessed, not before." There was a pause. For a long while Harvey Church said nothing, but in a thoughtful silence while Newmark waited. "All right," he whispered. "I tell you everything. I killed them both." "Who helped you?" "Nobody helped me. I did it alone." The stenographer was called again to take another confession, and Inspector Newmark had thought the confession of Parks was incredible, but it was no more extraordinary than the one that had come out from Church. "We drove to my house in the Packard," he said. "Doherty, Asmus, and I. I told them I had part of the money in the basement and asked Doherty to come inside with me. We went into the basement together. Asmus stayed outside in the car. When Doherty entered the basement, I twisted my hands behind his neck and snapped the handcuffs on him. Then I grabbed the baseball bat and slugged him over the head with it. He toppled over and began lashing out at me with his feet. I grabbed the piece of rope and tied his legs together. I'd heard the door open then, and when I looked around, I saw Asmus standing there. I did the same thing to him that I'd done to Doherty, except that I had to tie his hands. I slugged him on the head with the baseball bat and knocked him on the floor. Both their faces were all bloody now, and I guess the sight of that blood drove me insane. Anyway, I mauled and slashed them with everything I could lay my hands on, till they were covered with blood. I hit them with a hammer. I hacked them with a hatchet. I seemed to go completely out of my nut. I wanted to mash them both into bleeding pulps. I washed the blood off my hands," Church went on, "and went upstairs and got Mother and took her for a ride in the Packard. When we got back home that night, I went down to the basement, picked up Doherty, and carried him out to the car. I drove to the Las Plains River and heaved his body into the water. Then I went back home for Asmus. He was still breathing, and I found some of the cloth in the basement and an old brassiere of my mother's, and I jammed it down his throat. Brassiere of my mother's, and I jammed it down his throat. That's very significant itself. I picked up the body and carried it out to the garage. I backed my old car out and dug a hole to bury him. I threw him in the hole face down and jumped up and down on the back of his neck. Then I covered him with cinders and rolled the car inside so it covered the spot where I'd buried him. And that," said Harvey Church in conclusion, "is how the whole thing happened." Coroner Hoffman, who had listened to this with incredulity, demanded, "Who helped you do all that?" "Nobody helped me," said Church, with a touch of impatience. I did it all myself." The coroner was still sceptical. "Doherty," he said, "weighed 220 pounds. You weigh 135. How could you overpower him, handcuff him, murder him, and let alone carry him off from his car unless you had somebody to help you?" Church said, "Get me a set of handcuffs and the man who weighs as much as Doherty, and I'll show you how I did it." Among the detectives in the room was Sergeant Billy McCarthy, who had weighed up to upwards of 220 pounds. He had volunteered for the demonstration and gave Church a pair of handcuffs. In a twinkling, Church had the sergeant's hands cuffed behind his back. Then he lifted him from the floor, flung him across the shoulders, and marched him out of the room. He lowered him to the floor, picked him up again, and repeated the trip across the room. The officers stared in astonishment. The performance seemed beyond belief, yet there it was. Hoffman, however, was still dissatisfied. "If you killed those men alone," he persisted, "why did you drag in Parks and Wilder?" "He seemed to think some of the other guys did it," said Church, "so I dug up a pair for you." "Now tell us," said Captain Mullen, "why you wanted to kill those men." "I didn't want to kill them," said Church, "till I saw their blood." Now this is really important. "I did not want to kill them until I saw their blood." That seemed to drive me mad, like I told you. Doesn't this sound like the first story of the woman in the cult in Mexico? "I started to slaughter them." "Why did you entice Doherty into your basement and handcuff them?" "It was the only way I could get into the car. I hadn't enough money to pay for it. So you killed Doherty and then killed Asmus. in order to get an automobile. Is that right? I guess that's right, said Church. After he had read and signed 2 copies of the confession, he was allowed to see his mother. When he told her what she had done, she'd become hysterical and collapsed. Church's unmarried sister had arrived at from St. Paul, and was also there. She told the officer that Harvey had suffered a severe fall when he was a boy and was often irresponsible. Meanwhile, thousands of curiously morbid people were milling around Church's home, where he was taken there to reenact the double murder the police had to rope off the streets to restrain the crowds. Church was indicted for the murder, tried and convicted, and sentenced to hang. The entire case, from start to finish, had been filled with the unbelievable, and now had come the most incredible thing of all. Now, before I read the next bit, do you remember last year, the year before, I did a show on the DeFeo killings, Ronald DeFeo, and the murders at Amityville in the 70s? Nobody could believe that Ronald DeFeo did those murders on his own because of the volume of the guns. What if now I theorized that DeFeo was probably in some kind of similar state that Church was due to an accident or something, or involvement with a cult. But DeFeo moved from room to room with incredible speed. And even after he'd been found guilty, none of the neighbors came forward, as I pointed out, and said they heard the gunshots from that .03 rifle. Go back and listen to that show. It's the Amityville show. In fact, I'll put the link in the bottom so you can hear it. Notice how the similarities are all coming out here. You see, there's such a thing as crime that are murders, and there's murders that are inhuman. They're almost a product of something outside the human capability. The entire case from start to finish had been filled with the unbelievable, but now came the most incredible thing of all. When they locked Harvey Church in his death cell, he hypnotized himself. For days and nights he lay in a stupor, mind and body paralyzed, to all appearance dead. He had boasted the guards when they locked him up he would not be present at the execution. And apparently he knew what he was talking about. This is the entity that was going to leave. The entity that took control of him. There's even a photograph of Church while he's sitting in the court, and he's got that zoned out Xbox look that fanatical cult members have. There's something else controlling him. The warden thought Church was shamming and called in the doctors to examine him. The physicians used every test known to medical science, even touching lighted matches to his skin, but nothing could awaken him from his hypnotic sleep. Coroner Hoffman, still clinging to the theory that there was more than one person was involved in a double murder, believed Church had been drugged in jail to keep him from talking. He asked his Church mother and sister to permit him to perform an autopsy after the execution to determine whether Church was really in a comatose condition or the victim of some powerful drug, but they refused consent. So the coroner issued a public statement. I still believe that Harvey Church did not commit those 2 murders unaided. I suspect at least one other man was implicated in the double crime. Church is a weakling, physically and mentally, yet he stands convicted of something unheard of before in the criminal history of Chicago, perhaps the entire United States. His lips have been sealed. He is going to the gallows mentally dead. Why? Well, that's because there was something else inside him, an entity inside him who did these murders. Church was doomed to die on the gallows at 3:45 a.m., the witching hour, on March 4, 1922, less than 6 months after his handcuffed body of Bernard Doherty was found floating in the Las Plains River. A few minutes before his death, the death march was scheduled to start. A Salvation Army chaplain entered the prisoner's cell. Church lay on his bunk like a lump of clay, no movement, no sign of life. His eyes were closed and he seemed quite dead. The chaplain knelt by the bunk and said close to his ear, "Repeat after me the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven." There was no response. Church lay apparently lifeless. 2 deputies entered the death cell. "All right, Harvey, time to go." There was still no response from the inert body. The deputies crossed to the bunk and lifted Church to his feet. His eyes did not open. He was like a limp rag. Had the deputies not held him up, he would have slumped to the floor. There was something new to experience. The man could not only walk, he couldn't even stand. So they lifted Church from his bed, sat him in an ordinary kitchen chair, bounded him with a rope, and lifted the chair between them. He slumped limply as if he had fallen out and not been held in place. If he would have fallen out and not been held in place. His head sagged forward on his chest. His eyes were still closed. Thus they carried him to the gallows and placed him on a trap, still slouched unconscious against his bonds in the wooden chair. The noose was fastened around his neck. This pulled his head up, but his eyes did not open. Sheriff Charles Peters said to him, "Harvey W. Church, do you have anything to say?" There was no response from the inert form, no sign of life whatsoever. Sheriff Peters mentioned to the deputy. The deputy unfastened the rope around Church's body and slipped a white sack over Church's head. The sheriff gave the signal to spring the trap. There was a click and the floor fell away from beneath the chair. The chair dropped from under the man's body, struck the cement floor below, bounded away, and came to rest against the concrete posts. But the corpse of Harvey Church hung suspended in midair at the end of the hangman's rope. Now that's a remarkable story. That's when I came across this the other day, I couldn't believe it. Another interesting aspect of the case that was never mentioned until, well, it was never made an issue of until I found the original New York Times article, was that the day that Church had caused the hypnotism and basically bamboozled the police took place on September 11th, 1921. So I don't know if that means anything, but he actually became what he became on September 11th. So we have this. See, let's talk about this in terms of possession, assuming such things exist. His sister said he had, from St. Paul, said he had a fall when he was a young boy. Now, you could say to yourself, well, it made him into a psychopath, maybe it damaged his a proto-psychopath, damaged his frontal cortex. But there's also another aspect to it. It also may have brought about imbecility or schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is still a very, very strange medical condition we don't fully understand. Anyone who's worked with schizophrenics will tell you there's another entity in there that's not human, and its behavior, its sort of smugness, and its ability to control others was very apparent in the police interrogation of Church, especially when he got the other guy who was completely innocent to confess. They said it was hypnosis, but you need to actually put someone in a hypnosis state. You have to count down the number, you have to snap your fingers, you have to do something. Church just simply did it by looking at him. So it wasn't hypnosis, it was fascination. The entity that was in Church, there never was a Harvey Church as such. The entity that was inside him mocked the executioner by saying, "I'll be out of here." And it literally left him. He was dead in that room. It had no use for his body anymore, and it had moved on. The autonomous complex, the demonic entity, whatever that was inside him was in there. It was gone. This is also where he got his phenomenal strength from, and also his agility and speed. Although he was a frail 135-pound weakling man, when he was in these states of, and I'll use the word crude term, possession, or under the effects of an autonomous complex, he was incredible of the strength of the entity inside. This has also been shown with schizophrenics. This is why you have the 3 or 4 people, even a small female schizophrenic has to be held down. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. It was a bit dark, but we like to go into these subjects on the velocity of now. My website is www.thomassheridanarts.com. Also, www.streetdruid.net. If you want to help me out, I have a new book out that everyone loves, and I've got an upcoming interview with everyone who's read it has loved it, is with Greg Moffat, and so look out for that on Greg Moffat on his program, Legalize Freedom. his podcast, a very successful podcast. So I'll see you then. I'll be back on Sunday with the Sunday sermon, and so I'll see you in a couple of days, and feck them if they can't take a joke. Good night.